In a chilling turn of events, Brad Simpson, the man accused of murdering his wife, Suzanne Clark Simpson, was seen driving his truck with a bulky object wrapped in a blue tarp and purchasing cement just days after his wife's mysterious disappearance in October. These disturbing actions, revealed in a sworn arrest affidavit, suggest a premeditated attempt to cover up what would later become one of the most shocking domestic violence cases. As the investigation unfolded, it became clear that Brad's actions on that fateful day were not just a series of strange coincidences, but part of a much darker plan. The evening air at the Argyle was crisp, the kind of chill that reminded you fall was here. Inside, the warmth of the private club bathed everyone in a soft golden glow. Brad and Suzanne Simpson, dressed to impress, entered the room, smiles in place. To outsiders, they were the perfect couple, gracing the evening with their refined presence. But as they made their way through the crowd, there was a tension in the air, almost palpable. Brad's eyes never quite met Suzanne's. It was as if he were looking through her, his mind elsewhere. Suzanne, on the other hand, tried to appear engaged, but the fatigue in her eyes betrayed the facade she wore so well. They mingled with acquaintances, exchanged pleasantries with friends, all the while keeping up the pretense. But it wasn't long before the cracks began to show. A raised voice, a sharp word spoken under breath. No one noticed, but a small crack in the perfect mask had appeared. As the evening wore on, the whispers began to grow louder in Suzanne's mind. She had seen this before. The tightening of Brad's jaw, the way he clenched his fists when she said something he didn't like. It wasn't the first time, and it wouldn't be the last. But tonight, something felt different. There was an edge in Brad's voice that hadn't been there before. At 8:30 p.m., Suzanne knew the moment had come. She excused herself and their child from the event, a quiet excuse to leave early. Her feet felt heavy as she walked to the car, a feeling that settled deep in her chest. She didn't want to go home. She didn't want to face the reality of what waited for her there. In the back seat, her child quietly played with a toy, blissfully unaware of the storm brewing just ahead. Suzanne glanced at her phone. The message from her friend, "Are you okay?" made her stomach twist. How could she answer that? How could she explain the mess her life had become without sounding pathetic? They arrived home shortly after. Brad's silence in the car made her anxious. She wasn't sure what to expect, but she could feel the tension building between them like a storm gathering on the horizon. Once inside, Brad's mood shifted instantly. He slammed the door behind him and turned to face Suzanne, the irritation in his eyes unmistakable. "You didn't have to leave so early," he muttered, his voice low but laced with accusation. Suzanne's heart raced. "I just wanted to get home, Brad. I'm tired." "You're always tired," he snapped. "You think you're the only one with a hard life?" She froze, the words cutting through her like a knife. It wasn't just exhaustion. It was the weight of years of pent-up frustration. The quiet nights spent holding her breath while he raged. The nights spent walking on eggshells, fearing the smallest thing would set him off. "I just need some space," Suzanne replied softly, trying to keep her voice steady. Brad stepped closer, his eyes narrowing. "Space? You need space from me?" The way he said it made her stomach drop. This wasn't just a disagreement. This was a warning. She could feel it in her bones. Suzanne's thoughts raced, her mind scrambling for a way to diffuse the situation. But she knew it was too late for that. Brad was already too far gone. His temper, once a simmering pot, was boiling over, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. "Brad, please," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I don't want to argue." But he was no longer listening. His hands, once at his sides, clenched into fists. Suzanne took a step back, her mind screaming at her to leave, to run, to get away from him before things escalated further. Before she could react, Brad raised his voice. "You don't get to walk away from me, Suzanne?" Suzanne froze. It was the first time in years she had heard him use that tone. The fear that had always simmered beneath the surface of their relationship flared into full-blown terror. This wasn't just another argument. This was something much darker. As he stepped toward her, she backed up, her heart pounding in her chest. "Please, Brad," she begged, her voice trembling. But Brad wasn't listening. His face twisted in anger, and without warning, he reached out, grabbing her arm with enough force to make her wince. "Don't you dare try to leave me again," he growled. In that moment, Suzanne's world felt like it was closing in. She was trapped. There was no way out. Not anymore. Suzanne's heart raced as Brad's grip tightened around her arm. The sharpness of his fingers digging into her skin sent a wave of panic through her body. She had seen this side of him before, brief flashes of anger that quickly dissipated, But this time felt different. This time his fury burned too bright to be ignored. "Stop it, Brad!" Suzanne gasped, her breath shallow. Her voice quivered as she pulled her arm free, stumbling backward. She felt a cold wave of fear wash over her body instinctively retreating. She had to get away, she had to. Brad stood there, his eyes dark with rage, his chest heaving. For a moment, he seemed almost alien, like a stranger trapped inside a man she once thought she knew. "You think you can just walk away from me?" he spat, his words venomous. "You think you're better than me?" Suzanne opened her mouth to respond, but the words caught in her throat. She wanted to tell him that she was tired, that she couldn't take it anymore. She wanted to scream that this wasn't love, this was control, fear, and abuse, but she couldn't. The weight of his glare silenced her, pressing down on her like a heavy, suffocating blanket. "Brad," she said, her voice barely a whisper, "please just let me go, I need some space." The plea barely escaped her lips before he took a step forward, closing the distance between them with a predatory grace. "You don't get to walk away from me," he growled, his voice low and menacing. His breath reeked of alcohol, and the stench seemed to fuel the fire of his anger. Suzanne froze, her legs trembling beneath her. She could feel the familiar panic setting in, her pulse quickening as she instinctively took another step back. She needed to think, needed to find a way out, but she was trapped. There was no escape when he was like this. Brad raised his hand, and in that moment, everything went quiet. Time seemed to stretch out, every heartbeat like a distant drumbeat in the background. Suzanne's mind flashed to the moments of fear she had pushed aside, the times she had told herself it would be okay, that it wouldn't happen again. But it was happening again. Before she could react, he grabbed her by the wrist and pulled her toward him. The pain in her arm was sharp, biting. Suzanne gasped, her breath caught in her throat, the sudden rush of emotions overwhelming her. "Brad, stop!" she cried. But her words only seemed to fuel his anger. His grip tightened, and she could feel the heat of his rage radiating off of him. He was no longer the man she had married. This was someone else entirely. With every tug, every twist of her arm, Suzanne felt the last threads of her hope unravel. She had always known something was wrong, but now, standing there in front of him, the realization hit her with brutal force. She was alone in this. No one was coming to save her. No one knew what was happening behind closed doors. The tears that had built up over the years finally started to fall, but she could not bring herself to fight back anymore. She was too tired, too worn out. "Please, Brad," she sobbed, "I don't want to fight." Brad's expression flickered for a moment, almost as if he were considering something. His eyes softened, but only for a brief second before the mask of anger returned. "You don't get it, do you?" he sneered. "You're mine. I decide when you leave, when you stay. Not you." Suzanne's heart broke. This wasn't love. This was control. This was suffocation. With a final, desperate effort, she wrenched herself free from his grip, stumbling backward toward the door. Her pulse hammered in her ears as she reached for the doorknob. But just as her fingers brushed against the cold metal, Brad lunged forward, grabbing her again. This time, it wasn't her wrist. He held onto her shoulders, his fingers digging into her skin like a vice. "Where do you think you're going?" he snarled, his voice laced with fury. The room seemed to close in on Suzanne as she gasped for air, feeling the walls press down on her, the air thick with his rage. She could see the man she had once loved, a man she thought could protect her, now turned into someone unrecognizable. "I just need to go, please," Suzanne whispered, the words thick with fear. But it was too late. Brad wasn't listening. For a moment, he just stood there staring at her with eyes full of something unrecognizable. Then, in a sudden movement, he shoved her against the wall. The impact left Suzanne breathless, her back hitting the cold plaster. Pain shot through her body as she slid to the floor. Her vision blurred with tears, but through the haze, she could still see Brad standing over her, his breathing heavy. His face twisted with anger, but there was something else, something darker in his eyes. As she sat there, trembling, Suzanne realized something she had been denying for so long. This was no longer an argument. This was something much worse. This was a pattern, and it wasn't going to stop. Her body shook uncontrollably as Brad loomed over her, a smirk tugging at the corner of his lips. The man she had once loved was now her greatest fear, and she had no idea how to escape him. Suzanne's breath was shallow as she sat, pressed against the wall. The pain in her back throbbed, but it was nothing compared to the ache in her chest. She couldn't remember the last time she'd felt this small, this powerless. The man standing before her, the man she once trusted, now felt like a stranger. He wasn't the person she had married, the person who had promised to love her. Brad's eyes were cold, his hands clenched at his sides, his face twisted with fury. But beneath the rage there was something else, something darker, a look that made her stomach drop. "You think I'm just going to let you walk away from me?" His voice was low, laced with venom. His words didn't just sting, they cut deep. Suzanne tried to steady her breathing, but it was hard to focus. The overwhelming sense of dread flooded her mind, leaving her trapped in place. Her thoughts raced, but they were clouded by fear. She had been here before. She had felt this before, but this time was different. "Brad," she whispered, her voice shaky but filled with a quiet resolve. "I can't do this anymore. Please just let me go. I need to get out of here." He took a step forward, closing the distance between them, and Suzanne recoiled instinctively. "You think I'm just going to let you walk out that door? After everything I've done for you?" His words dripped with disdain, as though her desire to leave was some sort of betrayal. Tears welled up in Suzanne's eyes, but she fought them back. She couldn't break down. Not now, not in front of him, not like this. "I'm not the person I was when you met me, Brad," she said, her voice trembling. "I can't keep pretending everything is okay. I'm scared." Brad's eyes flickered for a moment. There was a shift in his expression, a fleeting glimpse of vulnerability. But it was gone in an instant, replaced by a cold, calculating look. "You think I don't know what you're doing?" he sneered. "You think you can just walk away from me, from everything we've built? You think I don't see through you?" Suzanne flinched at his words, each one landing like a slap. "I'm not trying to hurt you, Brad," she said softly. "I just need space. I need to breathe." The words barely left her mouth when he lunged toward her, his hand grabbing her wrist with an iron grip. The suddenness of it took her breath away. She gasped, her body jerking in pain as he pulled her closer, his face inches from hers. His breath was hot against her skin. "Space?" he hissed. "You don't get space. Not from me." Suzanne's pulse quickened, her heart pounding in her chest. The world around her blurred, her vision narrowing on his face, on the anger written there. She had always feared this side of him, the side that came out when he felt he was losing control. It was a fear that she had buried, convinced herself that it was just a phase, that things would get better. But now, as his fingers dug into her skin, she realized how much she had underestimated him. Her voice shook as she tried to speak, but the words caught in her throat. "Please, Brad, let go of me." He didn't respond. His grip tightened, his eyes narrowing with a cold fury that sent a chill down her spine. "No, you're not leaving me," he said, his voice low, almost a growl. Her body trembled as he held her, her legs threatening to give way beneath her. She had to get away. She had to leave. She couldn't keep doing this. She couldn't keep living in fear, but the more she struggled, the tighter his grip became. It was as if every movement she made only fueled his rage. In that moment, something inside Suzanne snapped. She was done. Done with the lies. Done with the fear. She had tried for so long to make things work, to believe that things would get better. But she couldn't anymore. Not like this. Not with him. With a burst of adrenaline, she shoved him off, her hands pushing against his chest with every ounce of strength she had left. For a moment he faltered, surprised by her sudden resistance. She used that moment to break free, stumbling backward toward the door. But before she could reach it, Brad's voice rang out cold and filled with menace. "Don't think you can run away from me," he warned. "You belong to me, and I will never let you go." Suzanne's breath caught in her throat. His words, his tone, were like a punch to the gut. She had heard him say things like that before, but never with such certainty, such cold finality. For a brief moment she stood frozen in place, her mind racing, her body trembling. She was trapped. There was nowhere to run, no one to turn to. All the doors had been locked shut, and Brad was standing between her and freedom. But Suzanne knew one thing for certain. She could no longer stay in this prison, no matter the cost. Suzanne's heart pounded in her chest, each beat a deafening reminder of the terror swirling around her. Her breath came in shallow gasps, her mind frantically searching for a way out. Brad stood in front of her, blocking the door, his presence suffocating. She was trapped. Every inch of her body screamed for escape, but her legs felt like lead, weighed down by a growing sense of dread. She could feel the walls closing in on her, the once familiar house now a prison. The man she had once loved was now an unpredictable force, his anger too fierce, his power too overwhelming. "Brad, please," Suzanne whispered, her voice barely audible. "I just need to go. I can't stay here anymore." He took a step toward her, his eyes narrowing, his jaw clenched in anger. "You think you can leave me just like that?" His voice was low and dangerous, each word coated in venom. "I've done everything for you, and you think you can walk away?" Suzanne recoiled, her back pressing against the wall. She didn't know how much more she could take. The years of emotional abuse had worn her down, but now, with his physical presence so close, the terror she felt was palpable. "I'm not walking away from you," Suzanne said, her voice trembling. "I'm walking away from this life, from the way you treat me." Brad's face twisted in rage. He was no longer the man she had married. The love and care had long since faded, replaced by control and violence. The man in front of her was a stranger, someone she could no longer trust. "You're mine," he spat, his words full of contempt. "You're my wife, and you'll never leave me. I'll make sure of that." The coldness in his voice sent a shiver down Suzanne's spine. She knew then, without a doubt, that she wasn't just dealing with a man in a fit of rage. This was something deeper, something darker. This was manipulation. This was control. Her mind raced, searching for a way out. She had to get away, but she couldn't outrun him. Not like this, not with the fear pressing down on her, making every movement feel like a fight against quicksand. Brad advanced toward her, his steps deliberate, as if he were savoring the moment. Suzanne's heart thudded in her chest, louder now, like the ticking of a clock counting down to something inevitable. "No," she whispered, backing away further, but her feet hit the chair behind her. She was cornered. There was nowhere left to go. Brad's lips curled into a sinister smile, his eyes glinting with menace. "You think you can hide from me? You think you can escape?" He reached out, grabbing her arm roughly, pulling her toward him. Suzanne gasped, the sudden pain in her wrist overwhelming her senses. She struggled, but his grip was unyielding. The terror coursing through her body made her feel small, powerless, but something inside her, deep within her core, refused to let him have complete control. "Let me go, Brad," she cried out, her voice breaking with desperation. He laughed darkly, the sound echoing in the small room. "You're pathetic, Suzanne. You really think you can stand up to me?" Tears welled up in Suzanne's eyes, but she refused to let them fall. She couldn't show him her weakness. She couldn't let him see her break. In that moment, she remembered the note she had written earlier, the one she had hidden from him, the one that spoke of her fear. It wasn't just a plea for help. It was a reminder to herself that she was strong, that she was worth something more than this. But as Brad dragged her toward the bedroom, his grip tightening, that strength felt like it was slipping away. This wasn't just an argument. This wasn't just a fight. This was a violent storm, and she was caught right in the middle. With every step he took, Suzanne felt herself being pulled deeper into the nightmare she had tried so hard to escape. She could feel the weight of it, the weight of his anger, his hatred, pressing down on her, suffocating her. She had nowhere to run, no one to turn to. She couldn't breathe. Her chest felt tight, the air thick and suffocating. But as Brad shoved her onto the bed, the reality hit her harder than ever. This was no longer just a momentary loss of control. This was a warning, a final warning. "You're not leaving me, Suzanne," Brad growled, his breath hot on her neck. "Not now, not ever." And in that instant, Suzanne realized the terrible truth. She was no longer in control of her own life. Brad had taken that from her, and no matter how hard she fought, no matter how much she begged, he would never let her go. Her body trembled, but something inside her snapped. She couldn't allow this to be her life. She couldn't stay in this prison any longer. She had to get out. She had to survive. But the fear, the helplessness, the suffocating weight of his anger, all of it overwhelmed her. She was trapped, and there was no way out. The hours after Suzanne's escape from Brad felt like a blur. Every moment that passed after she'd locked herself in the bedroom was marked by the sound of her heart racing in her chest. The pain of the past few days, weeks, months, perhaps even years, had settled deep into her bones. But it wasn't just her body that felt the weight of her situation. It was her mind, overwhelmed with a quiet, steady panic. Brad had given her no time to think, no time to breathe. After everything that had just happened, after that final warning, Suzanne knew she had to leave. She had to find a way out. But how? By the time Brad had finally left the room heading toward the kitchen, Suzanne's thoughts raced. She tried to calm herself. "Think, Suzanne, think." She quickly grabbed her phone, but her fingers trembled, making it difficult to unlock it. She had to reach out. She had to tell someone. Her heart sank as she stared at the screen. The contact list seemed so empty. Most of her close friends were long gone, isolated, pushed away by years of manipulation and control from Brad. The only person left was her mother, but Suzanne didn't want to alarm her just yet. There was no need to cause unnecessary panic. She threw on a jacket, not bothering with shoes. She couldn't think straight. She just had to go. The moment she stepped into the living room, she heard it, the faint hum of Brad's voice from the other room. It was like a warning bell, calling her back, drawing her attention. But this time, it was different. She didn't flinch. She didn't hesitate. She knew what had to be done. Suzanne rushed to the door, opening it as quietly as she could. She could feel the cold air outside, the wind brushing against her skin, but she didn't care. She had no time to waste. She had no more energy to waste on Brad. Not anymore. The world outside felt so vast. It was strange how she hadn't truly noticed how small and suffocating her world had become. But the more she walked, the more she realized just how far she had been pushed. Her entire life had been reduced to this: fear and silence, controlled by someone she loved, someone she once trusted. Brad had no idea she was leaving. He wouldn't know until it was too late. Suzanne couldn't help but feel a fleeting sense of triumph. But the fear gnawed at her, as if she could feel his presence looming even in his absence. As she walked, she tried to steady her breathing, but it was difficult. Every step away from that house felt like a monumental act. She had spent so long trying to escape, trying to justify to herself that things would change. But tonight, everything had shifted. For the first time in years, Suzanne allowed herself to think, was I always this afraid? She thought about the years of abuse, the silent nights spent in fear of waking him, the constant dread that filled every moment of her day. And yet here she was, out in the open, running away from it all. But no sooner had she crossed the threshold of their front door, the doorbell rang. Suzanne froze. It was him. Brad's voice rang out in the cold night air, sharp and commanding, but she couldn't bring herself to turn around. She had to keep moving forward. She couldn't stop now. She couldn't risk it. His steps were heavy like thunder, and his shout pierced through the night. Suzanne! But Suzanne's feet didn't stop. She pressed on, her breath catching as she turned a corner and kept running, her body screaming in protest. Keep going, keep going! The world around her seemed to fade, and all she could focus on was her need to get as far away from him as possible. She knew that if she stopped, if she allowed herself to look back, she might never have the strength to walk away again. By the time she reached the park, her legs were shaking, and her heart felt like it would burst from her chest. She had no idea where she was going. She didn't care. All that mattered was getting away, getting to a place where Brad's voice couldn't reach her. Her phone buzzed in her pocket. She pulled it out, feeling a momentary sense of dread when she saw the message. It was from Brad. "Where are you, Suzanne? You can't hide forever." Her heart sank. She had been right. He was looking for her. The next message came seconds later. "Come back, now." She didn't reply. She couldn't. But the panic started to crawl back. What if he finds me? What if he won't stop? For the first time in years, she allowed herself to acknowledge the fear. It was overwhelming, suffocating. Suzanne needed help. She needed someone to save her. But no one was coming. Brad's control over her life had been so complete, so consuming, that for a long time Suzanne had believed no one would listen. No one would believe her. It was then, standing alone in the park, that Suzanne realized the full weight of her decision. She had disappeared, and no one knew where she was. The night had fallen silent after Suzanne's frantic escape. She was somewhere out there, hidden in the vastness of the city. But Brad's obsession was relentless. The hours stretched, and yet Brad didn't stop searching. His face, frozen in a scowl, was just as haunting as the last words he had shouted at her. "You think you can run away?" As Suzanne fought to keep herself hidden, Brad began to shift from the rage of the moment into a more calculated mode of thinking. He wasn't going to let this go. He wasn't going to lose control, not without making sure Suzanne felt his presence, even in her absence. Back in the house, Brad methodically began his search. He hadn't seen her leave, not directly. He only knew that her disappearance left behind a trail of uncertainty that Brad wasn't willing to ignore. The silence was unnerving, but in the back of his mind, he knew this was the calm before the storm. He knew the disappearance would be noticed, and he had to act quickly to cover his tracks. As he paced through the house, a sense of urgency gnawed at him. He could feel the walls closing in, but he couldn't let it show. He didn't want anyone asking questions. Brad had been careful, but the smallest mistake could lead to everything unraveling. His search began in the bedroom. He opened drawers, rifled through the closet, but he was searching for something more than just signs of her absence. He was looking for her phone. He knew that once she realized she had left it behind, she would try to contact someone. After minutes that felt like hours, Brad found the phone, hidden under a pile of clothes in the corner of the room. Suzanne had made her last move so quickly, so instinctively, that she hadn't even realized she was leaving behind an important piece of evidence. Brad stared at the phone in his hand. The urge to destroy it, to erase it completely, gripped him. But he hesitated. His eyes darted over to the nightstand where a small notebook lay carelessly open. Suzanne's handwriting was familiar to him. He had seen it hundreds of times. But this time, as he glanced at the page, something made him pause. A single sentence caught his eye. A sentence that would prove to be his undoing. "I can't keep living like this." The realization hit him like a slap to the face. Suzanne had been planning this for a long time. She had been preparing for this moment, and he had been blind to it. This note was not just a cry for help, it was an act of defiance. Brad's fingers clenched tightly around the phone. A sudden surge of rage flooded through him. He couldn't allow her to expose him. He couldn't let her leave with anything that could prove what had been happening in their home. He knew what he had to do. He had to act quickly, decisively, before anyone realized what had happened. With the phone still in his hand, he turned toward the kitchen, his mind racing. Suzanne's absence had already been noticed, and it was only a matter of time before someone came to look for her. The phone, the note, these were the last things that could link him to her disappearance. They couldn't stay here, not with so many prying eyes. Brad's eyes flickered over the counter, where a black trash bag sat half-filled with discarded items. Without a second thought, he grabbed the bag and shoved the phone and notebook deep inside. He tied the bag tightly and made his way to the garage. His pulse quickened as he stepped into the cold, sterile space. He had no time to think about the consequences of his actions. He just needed to make sure there were no traces left. Outside, the night felt different. The world beyond his house seemed indifferent to the turmoil inside. He threw the bag into the back of his truck and slammed the tailgate shut. He felt the weight of his actions settle on him, but there was no turning back now. The trail was cold, and Suzanne was gone. Back inside the house, Brad turned off the lights and locked the doors. He made sure everything was in its place, each object untouched. If anyone were to come looking for Suzanne, they wouldn't find anything out of the ordinary. He couldn't let them find the evidence, not the phone, not the note. As he sat in the silence of the house, Brad couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted. Suzanne was gone, but she had left behind a part of herself. The words she had written, the phone she had abandoned, they were the keys to unraveling everything he had worked so hard to conceal. But for now, the world outside his house remained unaware. Suzanne had disappeared, and it was only a matter of time before the truth came to light. But for Brad, that time would come on his terms. He wouldn't let anyone take control of the narrative. He would bury the truth, and anyone who came looking would find nothing but a lie. Brad's mind raced. Every corner of the house felt like it was closing in on him, every sound a reminder of what he was trying to conceal. Suzanne had vanished, and with her disappearance came a sense of dread that weighed heavier than any physical object ever could. She was gone, and the house, once a symbol of control, of normalcy, now felt like a house of mirrors reflecting nothing but his own escalating panic. He had tried to keep it together, tried to act like everything was fine when he knew deep down that nothing was. Suzanne had left him, and as much as he wanted to believe she'd just run off, the reality was far more complicated. She knew too much. She had seen the cracks in their life that he had worked so hard to cover. Brad's breathing was shallow. The silence in the house was unbearable. Yet it was exactly what he needed. He couldn't afford to be seen unraveling. If anyone noticed weakness, they'd come looking. And when they did, he couldn't let them find anything. The last thing he needed was for someone to see through the facade he'd so carefully constructed. But every step, every movement, seemed to tighten the noose around his neck. Brad was no longer sure what he was running from. Was it the guilt, the fear of being caught, or was it the sheer possibility that Suzanne had planned her escape with a vengeance in her eyes? That thought alone was enough to make his stomach churn. He picked up his phone, checking for messages, but there was nothing. No word from Suzanne. No word from anyone. It was as if she had simply disappeared into thin air. It was then that he saw the message from her mother. "Have you heard from Suzanne? We're all worried about her." Brad's fingers hovered over the phone screen for a moment. He wanted to respond, to reassure her that everything was fine, but the words stuck in his throat. What could he say? How could he explain Suzanne's sudden disappearance without raising suspicion? He couldn't risk it. He had to keep his story intact. The lie had to be flawless. Suddenly, a thought struck him like a lightning bolt. Suzanne had left behind a trail he had to clean up. Her phone, the note, the mess in the bedroom, all of it was evidence. Evidence that could undo him. Suzanne had made her move. Now, it was his turn. Brad snapped into action. He grabbed the bag from the garage, the one that contained the phone and the notebook. He hadn't thrown it away yet. The truth was too close to the surface, and if anyone discovered it, his life as he knew it would be over. His hands trembled as he opened the bag. Inside, the phone stared back at him, the screen black, but he knew the danger it posed. He couldn't destroy it. He needed to hold on to it, just in case. But the notebook, the one with Suzanne's last written words, had to go. Brad couldn't let that piece of evidence survive. He walked over to the kitchen counter, his thoughts frantic. This is it. One last chance. Get rid of everything before it's too late. Brad moved quickly, his movements precise, controlled. He pulled open a drawer, grabbed a lighter, and set the corner of the notebook alight. The flames licked the paper, and for a moment he watched it burn. The smoke curled into the air, a silent witness to the destruction of his past. Suzanne's words, the last words she'd ever written, crumbled into ash. But even as the flames consumed the notebook, something gnawed at Brad. The fear, the doubt, the nagging feeling that Suzanne wasn't finished yet, that she would come back for him, and the evidence. He had to make sure there was no trace left. Brad looked at the bag again, the phone still nestled inside. It couldn't stay here. It couldn't stay in the house. His mind was racing now, the fear and adrenaline pushing him forward. Without another thought, he grabbed the bag, his body stiff with the urgency of the moment. He stepped outside into the cool night air, his breath ragged. His truck sat in the driveway, the perfect vehicle for his next move. Brad tossed the bag into the bed of the truck, the weight of it heavier than ever. He had to bury everything, make sure no one could ever link him to Suzanne's disappearance. The drive was a blur. The street seemed empty, the world eerily quiet as he made his way to the outskirts of town. His mind was consumed by thoughts of what had to be done. Suzanne had left, but she had left something behind, something that could ruin everything. Brad pulled up to a secluded spot, far from the prying eyes of anyone who might be watching. The darkness around him seemed to close in, like a cloak that shielded him from the world. He got out of the truck, moving swiftly, almost mechanically. He walked to a nearby patch of dirt, dug a hole, and buried the bag. As the earth covered it, Brad felt a strange relief, but it was short-lived. He knew it wouldn't be enough. The guilt, the fear, the tension, they were all building inside him, like a pressure that wouldn't stop rising. But for now, there was silence. For now, he had buried his secrets. The rest of the world would never know. Brad's heart raced as he sat in his car, staring at the empty road ahead. The weight of his actions had started to settle in, and with it came a sense of unease that he couldn't shake. His mind was racing. How long could he keep up the charade? How long could he hold the lie before it all came crashing down? The disappearance of Suzanne was now a matter of public concern. News outlets had begun to report it, and questions from friends and family started to pile up. Brad had to keep his story straight. One wrong move, one slip-up, and everything he'd worked so hard to hide would come to light. As he left the car and walked into his house, the silence greeted him like an old friend. He had grown used to it, this suffocating quiet that now filled every corner of the home he had once shared with Suzanne. But the emptiness now felt different. It felt like a void that couldn't be filled. Brad locked the door behind him, his eyes scanning the room for any signs of disruption. Everything appeared normal. The note he had burned, the phone he had hidden, no trace of Suzanne remained. He was careful, meticulous. He couldn't afford to make any mistakes. But even as he tried to reassure himself, a nagging thought kept creeping into his mind. What if someone found something? What if they figured out what had really happened? The phone buzzed in his pocket, snapping him out of his thoughts. He pulled it out, his stomach sinking when he saw the name on the screen. It was Suzanne's mother. His fingers hesitated for a moment before he answered the call. "Brad?" Her voice was full of concern, but there was an edge to it. She wasn't just worried, she was suspicious. "Yes, I'm here," he replied, trying to sound calm. "What's going on?" "We haven't heard from Suzanne," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "Is everything okay? We're really worried. She hasn't called anyone." Brad's stomach twisted, but he kept his voice steady. "I don't know where she is either. She left without saying anything. I've tried calling, but she's not answering. There it was, the first of many lies. He could feel the weight of them hanging in the air, thick and suffocating. Brad, this isn't like her, Suzanne's mother pressed. She wouldn't just leave without a word. Something's wrong. Brad's pulse quickened. Don't crack, he told himself. You've got this. I'm sure she'll turn up soon, Brad said, his voice firm, though his mind was in chaos. She's probably just needing some space. You know how she is. The silence on the other end stretched, and for a moment Brad thought Suzanne's mother might catch him in the lie. But then she sighed. I hope you're right, she murmured, her voice still shaky. I'll keep trying to reach her. Let me know if you hear anything. Of course, Brad replied, his voice almost too calm. As the call ended, Brad felt his heart sink. He had to keep up the pretense. He had to keep acting like everything was normal. But with every passing hour, the pressure mounted, and he felt himself slipping further into the web of lies he had spun. He walked to the kitchen, his thoughts consumed by the conversation. What would happen if someone found the evidence? What if Suzanne had already told someone? What if the police came knocking? Brad's hands shook as he poured a glass of water, the weight of the situation pressing down on him. He tried to calm himself, but his mind refused to settle. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Suzanne's face, her terrified expression, the way she had looked at him as she tried to escape. He saw the fear in her eyes, and it was too much to bear. The truth was closing in, and Brad knew it. Suzanne was gone, but her presence lingered in every corner of the house, and the lies he had told were beginning to crack, each one creating a fracture he couldn't mend. He couldn't keep running from the truth forever. But the question remained, would he be caught before he could silence the truth once and for all? Brad's phone buzzed again, breaking his train of thought. This time, it was a message from one of Suzanne's friends. Have you heard from Suzanne? She's not responding to anyone. Brad's heart skipped a beat, and for a moment, everything went still. His eyes darted to the corner of the room where the bag containing Suzanne's phone still sat, buried deep in the closet. He had to destroy it. There was no other choice. The lie was getting bigger. Suzanne had been gone for too long. Too many people were asking questions, and Brad couldn't afford to let his story unravel. He needed to act, and fast. Brad's pulse thundered in his ears as he sat in the dimly lit living room. The weight of his actions felt suffocating, pressing down on him with each passing minute. The lie was growing, expanding like a balloon, and the tighter he held on to it, the more fragile it became. Suzanne was gone, and the whole world seemed to be closing in on him. The phone buzzed again. This time it was a text message from one of Suzanne's close friends. The message was simple but urgent. Have you heard from Suzanne? She's not responding to anyone. Brad stared at the screen, his heart skipping a beat. Panic surged through him faster than he could control. He knew the truth was out there, lurking, waiting to be uncovered. Suzanne's disappearance was not just an absence. It was a mystery that was begging to be solved, a thread that had already started to unravel. The lies had to stop. His fingers hovered over the phone as he typed out a quick reply. I haven't heard from her either. She left without saying anything. I'm just as worried as you are. He hit send, then immediately regretted it. It sounded too rehearsed, too much like the story he had been telling everyone. But it had to be done. He had to keep the story straight. The silence in the room felt deafening. Brad ran his hands through his hair, his mind racing. He was losing control. The lies were catching up with him, and for the first time, he wondered if he could keep up the charade much longer. The evidence, Suzanne's phone, the note, he couldn't erase it all. The truth had a way of slipping through the cracks. Just then, he heard the sound of tires crunching against the gravel outside. His stomach dropped. Someone was here. Someone had come to check on him, to check on Suzanne. Brad's mind raced. He had to act fast. He moved quickly to the door, peeking through the blinds. A police car. 2 officers were standing outside, talking to someone. The words missing person floated through the air, and Brad's blood ran cold. This was the moment, the turning point. Without thinking, he grabbed his keys and rushed out the back door. He had to get away. He couldn't face them now. Not yet. Not when everything was on the verge of collapsing. As he drove down the empty road, Brad's hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly that his knuckles turned white. His thoughts were a blur, but one thing stood clear in his mind. He couldn't afford to be caught. Not now. Not after everything he had done to keep Suzanne's disappearance a secret. The lie had worked so far, but how much longer could he keep it up? The police, the questions, the worried calls. It was all starting to suffocate him. He needed to think. He needed time to regroup, to figure out how to bury the truth deeper, how to make sure no one ever found out what really happened. The road ahead stretched on, but Brad didn't feel the usual sense of calm he had when driving. He felt trapped. His hands trembled as he turned the wheel, the pressure of the situation finally cracking through his tough exterior. He had always been in control, until now. Now he was at the mercy of his own lies. His phone buzzed again. It was another message from Suzanne's friend. "We need to talk. I'm worried something's happened to her. This isn't like Suzanne." Brad's stomach churned. The realization hit him like a freight train. The people around him were starting to see through his carefully constructed story. Suzanne's absence was no longer a mystery that could be ignored. People were beginning to notice the cracks, and when those cracks widened, they would reveal everything. He didn't have much time left. The walls were closing in, and soon, the lies wouldn't be enough to protect him. The truth would come to light, and when it did, there would be no escape. Brad's mind raced as he pushed the gas pedal harder, driving faster, as if he could outrun the consequences, but the harder he tried to escape, the more the truth seemed to chase him. There was no running from this, no hiding, no way to erase the mistakes he had made. Suzanne was gone, but the damage he had caused, the lives he had broken, was starting to catch up with him. The trail of lies he had built was no longer a shield. It was a trap, and it was slowly tightening around him. As he sped through the empty streets, Brad realized with a sinking feeling that the turning point had come. There was no going back. And no matter how fast he ran, the truth would find him. Brad's hands gripped the steering wheel tighter, his knuckles white, as he sped through the empty streets. The adrenaline pumping through his veins was a mix of fear and desperation. The truth was closing in, and there was no escaping it now. The police were getting closer. The lies he had woven so carefully were starting to unravel, and he could feel the weight of them pressing down on him. Suzanne's absence wasn't just a disappearance anymore. It had become a mystery, and people were beginning to ask questions. Brad's mind raced with thoughts of the consequences, of how everything could collapse with a single mistake. But even with the threat of discovery looming over him, Brad couldn't stop. He was too deep in it now, too far down the road of deception. He had made too many choices, too many missteps to turn back. There was only one thing left to do: cover his tracks, destroy whatever evidence remained, and make sure no one could link him to Suzanne's disappearance. His phone buzzed again, pulling him out of his thoughts. This time it was a call, Suzanne's mother. His heart skipped a beat. "Brad," her voice was shaky, a mixture of worry and frustration. "Have you heard anything? Where is she? Why hasn't she called?" Brad's breath caught in his throat. He could feel the weight of the moment. He had been trying to avoid this, trying to keep his cool. But now Suzanne's mother was demanding answers. And for the first time, Brad's carefully constructed story seemed like it was about to crack. "I don't know where she is," Brad lied, his voice steady, though his insides were churning. "She's probably just taking some time for herself. You know how she can be, she just needs space." There was a long pause on the other end of the line, and Brad's heart pounded louder in his chest. He was praying that his words would be enough to reassure her, but Suzanne's mother wasn't convinced. "Brad, I know you're worried, but I don't believe this. She wouldn't just leave like this without saying anything. Something's wrong." Brad clenched his teeth, the panic beginning to claw its way to the surface. He could hear the urgency in Suzanne's mother's voice, and it only made his own nerves worse. The truth was no longer something he could hide from. It was out there, swirling just beneath the surface, ready to break free. "I'll let you know as soon as I hear anything," Brad said quickly, cutting the conversation short. "I'll keep trying to reach her." He hung up before she could say anything more, his mind spinning with possibilities. The walls were closing in on him, and the pressure was becoming unbearable. But he couldn't stop now. He had to finish what he started. Brad took a deep breath, trying to steady his shaking hands. He couldn't afford to slip up. He had to keep moving, keep acting like everything was fine. But the truth, Suzanne's voice, her fear, echoed in his mind. He could still see her face, the way she had looked at him when she tried to run, when she tried to break free. He knew she had been scared. He knew she had seen through him, and that scared him more than anything. With his heart pounding in his chest, Brad pulled up to a secluded area on the outskirts of town. He had made arrangements earlier to get rid of the last pieces of evidence, things that could tie him to Suzanne's disappearance, the phone, the notebook. He had to get rid of them for good. No more traces, no more evidence. He parked the truck and got out, moving quickly. His breath hung in the cold night air as he walked to the edge of the forest. The darkness seemed to swallow him whole as he carried the heavy bag, the weight of his actions pressing down on him with every step. This was the final step, the last move he had to make to erase everything. As he reached the clearing, Brad opened the bag and pulled out the phone and the notebook. He had already burned the note once, but he couldn't take any chances. The phone was the last link. He had to make sure there was nothing left, no trace of Suzanne's existence, no evidence that could lead anyone to him. He started digging, his hands shaking as he shoved the phone and the notebook into the hole. The earth was cold, hard, and unforgiving, just like everything else in his life. He buried the bag as deep as he could, making sure there was no way anyone could find it, no way anyone could trace it back to him. For a moment, Brad stood there staring at the ground. The reality of what he had done hit him harder than any of the lies or manipulations ever had. Suzanne was gone, and there was no going back. He had buried the truth, and with it, all the evidence. But as he stood there in the silence of the night, he couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The lie had worked for now, but for how long? How long before someone connected the dots, before someone uncovered the truth? He didn't know the answer. All he knew was that he had to keep running. He had to keep the lie intact, because if it all fell apart now, there would be no escape. The courtroom was silent as the jury filed in, their faces unreadable. The tension in the air was thick, suffocating even the most seasoned observers. Brad sat in the defendant's chair, his hands folded neatly in his lap, his posture rigid. The moment he had been dreading had arrived, the moment where his fate would be sealed. Across from him in the rows of spectators, Suzanne's family sat quietly, their faces a mix of sorrow and determination. They had waited for this day, waited for the truth to finally come to light. Suzanne's absence had left a hole in their lives, one that no verdict could ever fill. But they needed justice. They needed answers. And today, they would get them. Brad's mind raced. The weeks since Suzanne's disappearance had been a blur. His life had become a series of lies, half-truths, and carefully constructed facades. But now, everything was falling apart. The trial had exposed the cracks in his story, and the pressure was unbearable. The evidence had mounted against him, and there was nowhere left to hide. The judge's voice broke through his thoughts, calm and authoritative. "Members of the jury, have you reached a verdict?" Brad's stomach tightened. He knew what was coming. He had lived in this moment, replaying it in his mind over and over again. But now that it was here, it felt like a slow, painful unraveling. The foreperson stood and looked out over the courtroom. "We have, Your Honor." A wave of dread washed over Brad as the foreperson handed the sealed envelope to the judge. The room seemed to hold its breath, the silence deafening. His fate and the fate of Suzanne's family rested in the balance. The judge opened the envelope, and the courtroom waited for the words that would define the next chapter of everyone's lives. "Brad Simpson," the judge began, his voice steady, "you have been found guilty of the murder of Suzanne Clark Simpson. The jury has deliberated and returned a verdict of guilty on all charges." The words hit Brad like a physical blow, his chest tightening as the reality of what had just happened sunk in. He had known it was coming, but hearing it spoken aloud was a different matter entirely. His breath caught in his throat, and for a moment, the room seemed to spin around him. The judge continued, reading through the details of the verdict. But Brad didn't hear the words. His mind was still caught on the weight of the sentence. The walls that had been closing in on him for weeks had finally caved in. Suzanne's absence, her death, had caught up with him, and now there was no escaping the consequences. The courtroom was filled with a mixture of reactions. Suzanne's family held their heads high, though tears still glistened in their eyes. It wasn't a moment of triumph, it was a moment of finality. They had fought for this, for the truth to be known, and now it was. But no victory could bring Suzanne back. Brad's defense attorney stood beside him, his face stone cold as he took in the verdict. He had done everything he could to mitigate the charges, to find a way to weaken the case, but in the end, the evidence was irrefutable. Brad had woven a web of lies that had trapped him in the most unforgiving of ways. As the judge declared the sentencing phase to begin, Brad's gaze wandered to the empty chair where Suzanne should have been sitting. He could almost hear her voice in his head, a quiet whisper of disappointment. He had once promised to love her, to protect her, but now, all that was left was the truth he had tried so desperately to bury. The moment of the verdict was supposed to bring closure, But it didn't feel like closure. It felt like an opening, a door to a future that Brad couldn't escape. He had been caught in his own lies, and now the world would know exactly what he had done. The judge's final words echoed in Brad's ears as he stood to be escorted out of the courtroom. Sentencing will be carried out in 2 weeks. You are remanded to custody until that time. As he was led away, Brad's thoughts were consumed by the past. The events that had led him to this moment, the lies, the manipulations, the fear, had all come down to this. There was no denying it anymore, no way to shift the blame. The truth had been uncovered, and the consequences were now inescapable. For Suzanne's family, the verdict was a bitter pill to swallow. They had waited for justice, and they had gotten it, but it wasn't enough. Nothing would bring Suzanne back. Nothing would erase the pain of her absence. And for Brad, the reality was sinking in. His life as he knew it was over. He had destroyed everything that mattered, and now, the future he had once taken for granted had been ripped away. The silence of the courtroom was broken only by the sound of footsteps, the final echo of a long and painful journey that had led to the truth. The finality of the verdict had settled into a cold, painful reality. Brad was gone. Suzanne's family, though relieved that justice had been served, could not escape the emptiness that lingered in her absence. The trial had not been the end of their pain. It had only marked the beginning of the long journey ahead. Suzanne would never return, and no amount of justice could fill the hole she had left behind. The day after the verdict, Suzanne's family gathered at her mother's house. The quiet hum of murmured conversations filled the room, but no one really spoke. There were no more arguments to be had, no more questions left unanswered. They had found the truth, but that truth had come at the cost of Suzanne's life. Her mother sat in silence, a picture of her daughter clutched tightly in her hands. She looked at the smiling face in the photo, the image of a woman she had known as a daughter, before the fear had settled in, before the violence had changed everything. Suzanne's smile in the picture seemed so distant now, a memory from another time, a time before Brad had turned her world upside down. Her mother's voice broke the silence. "It's over, isn't it?" she whispered, as if she were asking not just about the trial, but about the years of pain, of heartbreak. Suzanne's family had lost her long before her body had disappeared. They had lost her in the moments when Brad's control had become suffocating, when Suzanne had started to shrink under the weight of his cruelty. They were left with pieces of a woman who had been too afraid to speak, too afraid to ask for help until it was too late. Outside, the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows over the house. For a moment, everything felt still. There was no more noise, no more movement, just the silent ache that seemed to hang in the air. And yet, in that stillness, something had shifted. The world was moving on, but the family was forever changed. They had fought for justice, they had fought for Suzanne, and they had won, but no victory could bring back the woman they had loved. Meanwhile, Brad sat in his prison cell, the reality of his new life beginning to sink in. His hands, once steady, now trembled with the weight of what was to come. His entire world had collapsed in the span of a few weeks, months perhaps. All the lies he had told, all the secrets he had buried, had led him here to this place of unending solitude. He had imagined this moment so many times, the verdict, the sentence, the aftermath. But now that it was real, it felt different. It felt final. There was no escape. There would be no turning back. Suzanne's family had won their justice, but it was him who would pay the price. The walls of his cell felt like they were closing in, suffocating him with each breath. There was no way out, no way to undo the damage he had done. Brad had destroyed everything, his marriage, his family, his future. All for what? To hold on to a power that had long since slipped from his grasp. His mind replayed the trial, the moment when the jury had declared him guilty. The weight of those words had sunk in, but even now, he couldn't fully grasp the reality of it. He had killed her. He had taken Suzanne's life, and for what? To hold onto a sense of control that had only existed in his mind? As the days stretched into weeks, Brad found himself haunted by memories of a time when Suzanne had been alive, when they had been a family. He remembered the quiet moments, the brief flashes of tenderness before the darkness had taken over. And now, there was nothing. No more warmth, no more love, only the cold, unrelenting truth. Suzanne's family, too, had their own aftermath to deal with. Justice had been served, but it hadn't brought Suzanne back. It hadn't healed the wounds that would never fully close. They had been left with nothing but the pieces of a life interrupted by violence and fear. In the end, there was no real closure. There was no way to undo the past. But in that silence, Suzanne's family found something. They found the courage to keep moving forward, to honor Suzanne's memory, and ensure that the truth would never be forgotten. What do you think of Brad Simpson's actions in this case? Do you believe justice has been served, or is there more to this tragic story? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. If you found this case shocking, don't forget to hit the subscribe button for more true crime stories and updates. Stay tuned for more gripping investigations and real-life mysteries.